Chapter 1. The Art of Reading People. There is a skill that most of us were never taught, never warned about, and rarely think about consciously. And yet it determines the outcome of almost everything that matters in our lives. It shapes who we hire and who hires us. It decides who we love, who we trust with our money, our time, our vulnerabilities, our dreams. It dictates whether the people we surround ourselves with lift us or quietly pull us under. And most of us are doing it almost entirely by accident. That skill is reading people, not in the shallow, surface-level way that most people do it, scanning someone's smile, feeling a gut reaction, deciding within seconds that a person is warm or cold, safe or threatening. That kind of reading happens automatically, and it has its uses. But it is also deeply unreliable. It gets us into bad business deals. It keeps us in relationships long past the moment we should have walked away. It blinds us to the people who mean us harm and causes us to push away the ones who genuinely have our best interests at heart. We size people up every single day of our lives, and the evidence suggests that we do it poorly, not because we are unintelligent or naive, but because no one ever showed us how to do it right. This is a book about doing it right. Think about the moments in your life when reading someone incorrectly changed everything. Maybe it was a business partner who seemed brilliant, motivated, and trustworthy, until the day you discovered that your shared bank account had been quietly drained. Maybe it was a colleague who praised your work to your face and dismantled your reputation behind closed doors. Maybe it was a friend whose loyalty you never questioned until a crisis arrived and they disappeared. Or maybe it went the other way. Maybe you kept your distance from someone who turned out to be the most honest, capable person you ever could have known, and you missed that entirely because something about them made you uncomfortable early on before you had any real data. The cost of misjudging people is staggering. It is rarely dramatic in the way we imagine it will be. A villain twirling a mustache, an obvious red flag waving in the breeze. More often it is quiet. A slow erosion. A partnership that never reaches its potential. A decade invested in a relationship that was never solid. A career derailed not by your own failures, but by the person you trusted to have your back. The price we pay for failing to read people accurately is not always visible in a single moment. Sometimes it accumulates for years before you feel the full weight of it. And yet most of us keep doing the same thing. We keep trusting our instincts, relying on first impressions. Or worse, relying on traits that feel reassuring but carry almost no predictive power. We trust someone because they're charming. We trust someone because they share our values on paper. The same religion, the same politics, the same taste in restaurants. We trust someone because they're confident, or because they have impressive credentials, or because they've been referred to us by someone we like. And sometimes these things align with trustworthiness, but far more often they are simply noise. Comfortable patterns that give us the feeling of certainty without giving us the substance of it. Here is the first uncomfortable truth. Trust is not the same as morality. It is not about whether someone is a good person in some abstract cosmic sense. It is about predictability. It is about your ability to anticipate, with some reasonable degree of accuracy, what a person will do when the moment of truth arrives. A person can be deeply decent, generous, and well-intentioned, and still be completely unpredictable in ways that make them impossible to rely on. And a person can have values that differ sharply from yours, operate in grey areas you would never enter yourself, and still be someone whose behavior you can forecast with near certainty because they are profoundly consistent. Trustworthiness, in the most practical sense, is consistency. It is the ability to know what someone will do before they do it. This distinction matters enormously because the moment you stop evaluating people based on whether you like them, whether they feel warm and familiar and aligned with your sense of the world, and start evaluating them based on what their actual behavior tells you about who they actually are, everything changes. You stop being surprised. You stop being blindsided. You start building the kind of relationships and alliances that don't just feel good, but actually hold up when things get hard. There is another truth here, one that is equally uncomfortable. The conventional rate of accurately predicting whether someone will behave with integrity and follow through on what they promise has never been much better than a coin flip. Roughly half the time, our assessments of people are simply wrong. This is not a reflection of how perceptive or intelligent any given person is. It is a statement about how poorly equipped most of us are when it comes to the tools we use to make those assessments. Intuition, which is the method most of us default to, is essentially pattern recognition built on experience. And while it has genuine value, it is also vulnerable to every bias, fear, and desire we carry inside us. We see what we want to see. We believe what is comfortable to believe. We mistake familiarity for trustworthiness, enthusiasm for competence, and likability for loyalty. The framework at the heart of this book exists to fix that, not by eliminating intuition entirely. Intuition still has its place, especially in detecting discomfort and flagging something that deserves closer attention, but by giving you something more reliable to stand on. A system, a set of specific, observable signs that you can watch for in the people around you, patterns of behavior that tell you far more about who someone actually is than anything they could ever say about themselves. To understand why this matters so deeply, consider for a moment the world you actually live in. You are surrounded every single day by people whose motives you cannot fully see, whose histories you cannot fully know, and whose futures you cannot fully predict. Many of these people are strangers. Some of them will remain strangers, but others will move closer into your workplace, your home, your circle of trust. And with each step closer they take, the stakes of reading them correctly go up. This is not a paranoid view of the world, it is a realistic one, and there is a profound difference between those two things. Paranoia assumes the worst about everyone. A realistic assessment operates differently. It withholds judgment until it has enough objective, observable data to make a sound prediction. It does not rush to condemn, but it also does not rush to embrace. It is patient, curious, and methodical. It asks not, does this person feel trustworthy, but what does this person's actual behavior tell me about how they are likely to act? One of the most important principles underlying all of this is the idea that people, almost without exception, act in their own best interests, not always in ways that are selfish or harmful. In fact, a person's self-interest very often includes helping others, building strong relationships, and contributing to the well-being of the people around them. The desire to be respected, to be valued, to be part of something meaningful. These are forms of self-interest, and they frequently drive people toward genuinely good behavior. But understanding that self-interest is the primary engine driving human action gives you an enormous advantage. It means that when you want to understand what someone will do, the most powerful question you can ask is not what do they say they'll do, but what does their own best interest suggest they'll do? When those two answers align, you have a reliable prediction. When they diverge, when what someone says they'll do conflicts sharply with what their self-interest suggests they'll do, that divergence is a signal worth taking very seriously. Consider a person in your life, someone you've known for a while, who has always talked about generosity, collaboration, and showing up for the people they care about. Their words paint a picture of someone devoted to the well-being of others. But when you look at the pattern of their actual behavior, you notice something else. When things get hard, they disappear. When the balance of give and take tips in a direction that costs them something, they quietly step back. When their interests and yours come into conflict, theirs consistently win. The words haven't changed, the self-presentation is the same, but the behavior tells a different story. And the behavior is the truth. This is not about being cynical, it is about being clear-eyed. And there is a kind of freedom in that clarity. When you learn to separate what people project from what people actually do, you stop being victimized by the gap between the two. You start making decisions based on data rather than hope. And the quality of every decision you make, every partnership you enter, every person you invite into your life, improves as a result. There is also something important to understand about desperation. Human behavior exists on a spectrum, and one of the most powerful forces that can push a person to one extreme or the other is how desperate they are. When someone is in a state of genuine desperation, financial, emotional, professional, personal, the predictability of their behavior shifts dramatically. Desperation can drive people to do things they would never do under ordinary circumstances, including betraying the people closest to them. A person whose character you've always trusted can become someone you barely recognize when the pressure becomes unbearable enough. This is not a moral judgment. It is simply a fact about human beings operating under extreme stress. Understanding it doesn't mean you abandon people when they're struggling. It means you pay closer attention, you watch more carefully, you verify rather than simply assume. And verification is the final principle worth holding on to here at the start. Even when you trust someone, even when every sign you've gathered points toward their reliability, you verify. Not because trust means nothing, but because trust that is tested and confirmed is always stronger than trust that is assumed. There is an old saying that goes, trust but verify. It is not cynicism dressed up as wisdom. It is the acknowledgement that even the most trustworthy people can mislead you, sometimes on purpose, and sometimes without even realizing it. The most dangerous illusions are often the ones we help create for ourselves, filling in the gaps with what we want to be true rather than what the evidence actually supports. Reading people accurately is not about eliminating uncertainty. You cannot do that. You cannot achieve perfect knowledge of another human being. Not ever, not fully. People are too complex, too layered, too capable of change. What you can do is dramatically reduce the margin of error. You can shift from that coin flip baseline, from being right about people roughly half the time, to something far more reliable. You can learn to spot the signs that actually matter. You can learn to separate the meaningful signals from the comfortable illusions. You can build relationships on solid ground rather than sand, make choices based on patterns rather than feelings, and navigate the world of people with something you may never have had before. Genuine confidence. That confidence is not arrogance. It is not the belief that you can know everything about everyone. It is something quieter and more durable than that. It is the knowledge that you have a framework, a real, tested, practical system for understanding the people in your life. And once you have that, the way you move through the world will never quite be the same. Chapter 2. Think like a behaviorist. Most people believe they are good judges of character. Ask almost anyone and they will tell you that they have solid instincts about people, that they can read a room, sense dishonesty, detect hidden motives. They trust the feeling in their gut the way others trust a compass. And most of the time, that feels justified, because we remember the moments when our intuition was right. We replay them quietly in our minds, building a private mythology of our own perceptiveness. What we rarely do is remember the times we were wrong. The friend who turned out to be a rival, the business partner who seemed like the most capable, trustworthy person in any room, until they weren't. The employee who interviewed brilliantly and performed miserably. The colleague we wrote off as cold and difficult who turned out to be the most loyal person we ever worked with. These moments exist in every life. They are just as real as the moments when our instincts served us well. But because they are painful, because they are embarrassing, because they conflict with our self-image as perceptive people, we tend not to catalogue them with the same care. We forgive ourselves for being fooled, and we move on, back to trusting our gut. This is how the cycle continues. And this is exactly why, if you want to read people with any real reliability, the first thing you have to do is make a deliberate, conscious decision to stop trusting only your instincts and to start thinking differently. Not without feeling, not without intuition, but differently, more systematically, more objectively, more like someone whose entire career depends on getting it right. The shift required here is not a small one. It runs counter to some very deeply held ideas about how we connect with other people and how we decide who to trust. Most of us were raised to believe that trust is primarily an emotional experience, that you feel it or you don't, and that feeling is essentially reliable. We were taught to look for warmth, for eye contact, for the kinds of signals that say, this is a good person. And there is something genuinely valuable in those instincts. They evolved for a reason. In small, stable communities where everyone knew everyone else, where reputation traveled fast and behavior was visible and accountable, the social instincts that drove trust were reasonably effective. But we do not live in small, stable communities anymore. We live in a world of strangers, and our social instincts have not caught up. The person who interviews you for a job is a stranger. The vendor who pitches their services is a stranger. The person you meet at a conference and exchange numbers with is a stranger. The contractor who renovates your kitchen, the financial advisor who manages your savings, the new colleague who seems enthusiastic and eager to help. In all of these relationships, you are working with radically incomplete information. You are making high-stakes assessments based on brief, often carefully curated presentations of self. And the tools most people use for those assessments A warm smile, confident body language, a sense of shared values, the recommendation of a mutual acquaintance are the same tools that skilled manipulators use to construct their personas. Charm is easy to fake. Confidence can be manufactured. Shared values can be claimed by anyone. What cannot be faked so easily, or at least not indefinitely, is behavior. Actual, observable, consistent behavior over time. Not what someone says about themselves, but what they do. Not the impression they create in a first meeting, but the patterns they reveal across multiple interactions, multiple contexts, multiple pressures. This is where the difference between a skilled behavioral reader and an average one becomes most apparent. The average person responds to impression. The skilled observer responds to data. What does it actually mean to think like a behavioral analyst? It means applying a specific set of disciplines, most of which run directly counter to our natural instincts, every single time we are trying to assess another person. The first and most fundamental of these disciplines is the commitment to objectivity. This sounds simple. It is not. Objectivity in assessing people means consciously separating what you feel about someone from what the evidence actually shows. It means being willing to see something unflattering in a person you like, and being equally willing to see something admirable in someone you're predisposed to distrust. It means catching yourself when you are explaining away red flags because they would be inconvenient to acknowledge. It means noticing when you are filling in gaps in your knowledge with wishful thinking rather than actual observation. Emotional hijacking is the term for what happens when your feelings override your judgment. It happens constantly in ways both dramatic and subtle. The dramatic version is easy to recognize. You are so charmed by someone that you ignore obvious warning signs, or you are so threatened by someone that you dismiss their genuine contributions. But the subtle version is more common and more dangerous. It shows up as the slight extra weight you give to information that confirms what you already believe, and the slight skepticism you apply to information that challenges it. It shows up as the comfort you feel with people who are similar to you, who share your background, your vocabulary, your aesthetic, your worldview, even when similarity has nothing to do with reliability. Understanding this particular bias is critical because it is one of the most pervasive errors in human judgment. We consistently overestimate the likelihood that people who resemble us will also share our values and behave as we would. We treat familiarity as a proxy for trustworthiness, and we treat difference as a signal for caution. But the evidence does not support this. People who share your religion, your political affiliation, your ethnicity, your socio-economic background are not statistically more likely to behave with integrity toward you than people who don't. The factors that actually predict trustworthy behavior, vesting, longevity, reliability, consistent action, honest language, emotional stability, have nothing to do with demographic similarity. Nothing. The second discipline is the willingness to collect data before drawing conclusions. This requires a particular kind of patience that our culture does not encourage. We live in an era that celebrates quick reading, rapid assessment, the confident snap judgment. We celebrate the executive who sizes someone up in a handshake. We distrust the person who says, "I don't know yet, I need more information." But in the assessment of people, the hunger for premature certainty is a liability. The more quickly you conclude that you have someone figured out, the less likely you are to notice the evidence that complicates your picture. The more committed you become to a first impression, the more resistant you become to updating it when new information arrives. Data-driven assessment is not slow or passive. It simply means that before you decide how much to trust someone, before you extend significant confidence, significant resources, or significant vulnerability to them, you have gathered actual, observable, verifiable information about how they behave, not how they present themselves, not what they say about themselves, how they actually behave in real situations, over real time, especially when things are difficult. There are 4 channels through which this data flows. The first is verbal communication, what people say, and crucially, how they say it. Not just the content of their words, but their patterns of speech, what they choose to talk about, how they handle topics that are sensitive or uncomfortable, whether their language tends toward generosity or toward judgment. The second channel is non-verbal communication, the body language that either confirms or quietly contradicts what someone is saying. Facial expressions, posture, eye contact, the rhythm of breath, the timing of reactions. These are harder to control consciously than words, and so they often reveal what words conceal. The third channel is past and present actions, what someone has actually done, verified as much as possible through sources other than themselves. Resumes are written by the least objective person in the room. References are often chosen because they are friendly. But behavior is behavior, and patterns of behavior over time are among the most reliable predictors of future behavior that exist. The fourth channel is stated and observed intentions. What someone is genuinely trying to achieve, and whether their goals align with yours in ways that create a natural incentive for their loyalty and cooperation. The third discipline that defines the behavioral mindset is the deliberate suspension of judgment. This one is counterintuitive because judgment feels like discernment. Judging people, forming opinions about them quickly and confidently, feels like an act of intelligence. But premature judgment is actually one of the most effective ways to make yourself blind. When you decide that someone is untrustworthy, competitive, difficult, or threatening, you stop gathering new information about them because the conclusion has already been reached. And conclusions reached early are almost always incomplete. The suspension of judgment does not mean pretending you have no impressions. It means holding those impressions lightly, treating them as hypotheses rather than conclusions, and remaining genuinely open to the evidence that might revise them. This is harder than it sounds, especially when your initial impression is negative, when someone has done or said something that triggers discomfort or mistrust. The pull toward confirmation is powerful, but if you can maintain enough discipline to keep observing, to keep gathering, to keep your conclusions provisional until the data is sufficient, you will see things about people that most others miss entirely. The fourth discipline is perhaps the most important and the most difficult. The ability to see situations from the other person's perspective rather than your own. Not in the soft, empathetic sense of imagining how they feel, but in the harder, more analytical sense of understanding how the situation looks from inside their life, their goals, their fears, their constraints. What are their incentives? What do they have to gain or lose? What pressures are they operating under? What does their best interest actually suggest they will do? And does that align with what they're telling you? This perspective taking is a form of intelligence gathering. When you understand what someone genuinely needs, what they are genuinely afraid of, and what they genuinely value, you can predict their behavior with far greater accuracy than any amount of gut-feeling assessment will ever give you. And here is what makes this particularly powerful. Most people never do it. They remain so anchored in their own perspective, so focused on how they feel about the other person, what they want from them, how the interaction is going from their own point of view, that they never stop to inhabit the other perspective with any real depth. And so they are perpetually surprised by behavior they could have anticipated if they'd simply asked the right questions. There is also something important to understand about the relationship between power, accountability, and predictability. People who face significant consequences for their behavior tend to be more predictable than people who don't. Not because people with power or immunity are inherently less honest, some of them are extraordinarily principled, but because the structures that enforce accountability are some of the most reliable drivers of consistent behavior. When someone knows that you will be there tomorrow, next month, next year, when they know that their reputation with you has a long future, they are far more motivated to behave in ways that protect and build that reputation. When someone believes the relationship is short, or when they operate in contexts where consequences are rare, the behavioral calculation changes. This is why context matters so much in reading people. The same person can be reliably trustworthy in one situation and dangerously unpredictable in another. The colleague who would never compromise their integrity in their area of deep competence might cut dangerous corners under pressure in an area where they feel insecure. The friend who is completely honest when things are stable might be capable of extraordinary deception when they are desperate. Character is not fixed. It is expressed within contexts, under pressures, in response to temptations and constraints. The behavioral analyst understands this not as a reason to distrust everyone, but as a reason to pay attention to context, to understand not just who someone is in general, but who they are in the specific situation you are both navigating together. Finally, there is the question of incompetence, one of the most underappreciated sources of unpredictable behavior. When people mislead you, we tend to assume they are doing so deliberately, but a significant portion of the unreliability in human relationships stems not from dishonesty, but from a fundamental lack of self-awareness. People routinely overestimate what they can do. They make commitments in good faith that they genuinely cannot keep. They believe they are capable, reliable, and consistent, while the gap between their self-perception and their actual performance generates a steady stream of disappointment for the people counting on them. Reading this kind of person accurately requires distinguishing between an unwillingness to perform and an inability to perform. Two very different problems that call for very different responses. What you are building across all of these disciplines is not a machine for suspicion. It is something far more valuable, a framework for clarity. The goal is not to become someone who trusts no one, but to become someone who trusts the right people, for the right reasons, at the right level of depth and commitment. Someone who builds relationships on observation rather than assumption, on data rather than desire, on a clear-eyed understanding of what another person is actually likely to do rather than what you wish they would do or what they say they will. This is the foundation. Everything that follows builds on it. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Trust. Every relationship in your life, every meaningful one, every disappointing one, every one that surprised you by lasting longer than you expected or collapsing sooner than you feared, was built on a hidden structure. Most people never see that structure. They experience only the surface, the warmth or the coldness, the loyalty or the betrayal, the sense of being truly known or being constantly misread. But underneath all of it, underneath every human connection that has ever shaped you, there is an architecture. And like any architecture, it either holds weight or it doesn't. It either distributes stress well enough to stand through pressure and time, or it reveals its weaknesses at exactly the worst moment. Understanding that architecture, knowing what makes it strong, knowing what makes it look solid while being hollow, is the difference between navigating your relationships with real confidence and navigating them with the kind of hopeful guesswork that leads to the same painful outcomes over and over again. The framework you are about to step into is built on 6 observable signs, not feelings, not impressions, not the kind of amorphous sense of someone that forms in the first few minutes of meeting them. 6 specific, identifiable, behavioral patterns that you can actually watch for, actually test, actually verify. Patterns that, taken together, give you the most reliable picture of how someone will behave when it matters most. Each of the 6 signs points to something real about a person's relationship with you, about how they see you, what they believe is at stake in their connection with you, and what they are actually likely to do when the easy road diverges from the faithful one. Before we go into each sign individually, there is something important to understand about how they work together. The 6 signs are not a checklist. They are not a scoring system where you add up the points and declare someone trustworthy above a certain threshold. Human behavior is too complex for that kind of mechanical assessment, and the moment you start treating it that way, you lose the nuance that makes the framework powerful. The signs are better understood as dimensions, multiple lenses through which you examine the same person in the same relationship, each one revealing something that the others cannot. Someone might score extraordinarily well on one dimension and reveal troubling patterns on another. The picture that emerges from all 6 together is the one you use, not any single element in isolation. It is also worth saying clearly at the outset that these signs are not static. They describe not a fixed quality of a person, not who someone is in some permanent, essential sense, but a dynamic reality, who someone is in their relationship with you, in their current circumstances, under their current pressures. People change, situations change. Someone who is genuinely invested in your success during a period of aligned interests may become a neutral party or even an antagonist when those interests diverge. This is not a betrayal of character necessarily. It is simply the reality that trustworthy behavior is always contextual, always the product of a person meeting a situation. Reading people well means reading both. The first of the 6 signs is called vesting, and it may be the single most powerful predictor of trustworthy behavior in any relationship, professional or personal. To understand it fully, you need to start with a simple but profound observation. People do what serves their interests, not always in ways that are selfish in the narrow sense. In fact, often in ways that are deeply generous and cooperative. But the engine driving consistent, reliable behavior toward you is almost always some form of self-interest. When someone genuinely believes that your success is connected to their own, when they see your well-being as part of their well-being, your advancement as part of their advancement, your protection as something that matters to them personally, they become extraordinarily reliable allies. Their motivation to support you, to protect you, to follow through on what they promise you is not just moral, it is personal. It is rooted in the most durable of all human drives, the drive to pursue one's own flourishing. Think about what this means in practice. It means that the most reliable predictor of whether someone will show up for you is not whether they are a fundamentally good person in some abstract sense. It is whether they see your success as intertwined with their own. A business partner who genuinely believes that your performance strengthens the company you both belong to, and that the company's strength directly affects their livelihood, is far more predictably loyal than a business partner who likes you and admires your values but sees your success as separate from theirs. A colleague who has staked their own reputation on your project's outcome is more reliably committed to its success than a colleague who is simply assigned to it. A friend who has genuinely invested their own emotional energy, their own social capital, their own time into your life is more predictably present in your difficult moments than a friend who cares about you in a general, undirected way. This is not cynicism, it is clarity, and recognizing it does not reduce trust to something transactional and cold. It actually points you toward the most durable form of trust that exists. Because when vesting is genuine, when the connection between your success and someone else's is real and felt and not merely theoretical, what emerges is not just reliability. What emerges is genuine partnership, the kind that shows up unsolicited, that notices when you need help before you ask for it, that generates the kind of loyalty that holds not just when things are going well, but when things are hardest. The question then is how to recognize it. Vesting communicates itself through behavior, not proclamation. Someone who is genuinely vested in your success does not simply tell you so. They show you in consistent, verifiable ways. They adjust to your tempo rather than insisting you match theirs. They speak about your goals and interests rather than centering every conversation on their own. They create opportunities for you rather than waiting for you to ask. They celebrate your wins with authentic enthusiasm rather than the slightly guarded approval of someone who hasn't quite let themselves see your success as their own. They call in their own favors on your behalf at some cost to themselves because spending their social capital to support you feels natural and worthwhile rather than burdensome. Contrast this with what vesting looks like when it's absent. And learning to read the negative signs is just as important as recognizing the positive ones. When someone is not vested in your success, they reveal it in quieter ways. They talk primarily about their own interests when you're together. They become notably less engaged when conversation turns to your challenges or ambitions. They offer support in theory, but rarely in practice. They are available when the relationship benefits them and suddenly busy when it costs them something. None of these signals, in isolation, is definitive. There are 100 innocent explanations for any single behavior. But patterns are definitive, and the pattern of someone who is consistently more interested in your relationship when it serves them than when it doesn't is a pattern worth taking seriously. There is also a mirror dimension to vesting that often gets overlooked, and it may be the most important one. How much are you vesting in others? The reciprocal nature of vesting is not just poetic, it is practical. When you genuinely invest yourself in the success of the people around you, when you make their goals part of your own concerns, when you offer your resources and connections and effort, not because you're required to, but because you actually believe that their flourishing matters to you, you create the conditions under which others vest in you. This is not manipulation. It is not a strategy for extracting loyalty by manufacturing the appearance of investment. It is the recognition that vesting is fundamentally a culture, not just a behavior, and that cultures are created by the choices of the people who inhabit them. If you want to be surrounded by people who are genuinely invested in your success, the most powerful thing you can do is be someone who is genuinely invested in theirs. The second sign is longevity, and it addresses one of the most important and least examined forces in human behavior, the time horizon of a relationship. When someone believes they will know you for a long time, when they see their connection with you as something that will extend months and years into the future rather than concluding in the near term, something fundamental shifts in how they treat you. The accountability that comes with a long relationship changes the calculation of every interaction. Decisions that might be tempting in a short relationship, cutting corners, overpromising and under-delivering, prioritizing their immediate interest at your expense, become far less attractive when the person knows they will be sitting across from you again next month, next year, 5 years from now. Long relationships create natural incentives for trustworthy behavior in a way that short ones simply cannot. This principle operates everywhere, though most people experience it without naming it. Think about how differently people behave with a customer they will never see again versus a client they expect to work with for years. Think about how differently someone negotiates with a counterpart they need to collaborate with long-term versus one they'll never encounter again. Think about the quality of behavior you tend to see in settings where reputation is permanent. Small communities where everyone knows everyone, professional networks where word travels fast, versus settings where anonymity allows people to treat each encounter as essentially consequence-free. The pattern is consistent. Where relationships are perceived as long, behavior tends to be better. Where they are perceived as short, all bets are off. What this means practically is that one of the most powerful things you can do to encourage trustworthy behavior in the people around you is to make the future of your relationship feel real and long to them. Not by making promises you can't keep, but by demonstrating, through your own behavior, through your continued presence and engagement, through the depth of investment you make in understanding them, that this connection has a future worth protecting. When someone feels that, their relationship with you becomes something they have a stake in. They start treating it like an asset rather than an expense. And assets, people protect. The observable signs that someone perceives your relationship as long are some of the most reassuring signals you can receive in any professional or personal context. They include you in long-term plans and conversations about the future. They build traditions and rituals around your connection. The recurring lunch, the standing check-in, the shared reference points that accumulate over time and create a private language of relationship. They speak in terms of we rather than I and you when talking about what lies ahead. They invest in your growth, recommending you for opportunities, sharing their networks, supporting your development in ways that only make sense if they intend for you to be around long enough to matter. And they never take you for granted in the way that only proximity can breed, because they understand on some level that the long future they're counting on with you depends on treating the present carefully. The absence of these signals is equally informative. When someone never includes you in conversations about the future, when the relationship feels perpetually present tense, valuable in the moment but not clearly connected to anything ahead. When they speak about you, your role, or your contribution in terms that feel finite or conditional, when they invest little in the depth of understanding that a long relationship naturally generates, these are not confirmations of bad intent, but they are honest reflections of the time horizon someone sees for their connection with you. And a short time horizon, whatever its cause, is a context in which the predictability of someone's behavior toward you is significantly reduced. The third sign, reliability, is perhaps the most straightforwardly practical of all 6, and the most commonly misunderstood. Reliability is not simply a matter of character. It is not enough to want to be someone who comes through. Reliability is the product of 2 things working together: competence and diligence. Competence means someone can actually do what they say they will do. Diligence means they will apply the sustained effort required to do it, even when it is difficult, even when it is inconvenient, even when other priorities compete. Without both elements present, reliability cannot exist, and the absence of either produces the same outcome: someone who cannot be counted on. This distinction matters more than most people realize, because the most common form of unreliability is not dishonesty. It is the extremely common human tendency to overestimate one's own capacity. People make commitments in genuine good faith and genuinely fail to keep them. Not because they chose to let you down, but because they lacked the realistic self-assessment to know what they were actually capable of. The colleague who volunteers for every project and delivers none of them well. The friend who promises to be there and genuinely wants to be and repeatedly isn't. The mentor who opens doors and then doesn't have the follow-through to walk you through them. In all of these cases, the problem is not malice. It is the combination of optimism and low self-awareness that produces a gap between what someone believes they can give and what they can actually deliver. Reading reliability accurately requires you to look past what someone says about themselves, past their confidence, their enthusiasm, their track record as they describe it, and toward actual evidence of past performance. Not in the spirit of suspicion, but in the spirit of someone making a serious decision. What has this person actually done, verified through sources other than themselves? Where have they followed through under pressure and where have they not? Where does their competence genuinely lie as opposed to where they believe it lies? And beyond competence, do they have the kind of sustained, disciplined effort that makes skill into results? Because skill without diligence is a beautiful engine sitting in a garage. Impressive to look at, useless when you need it. Trust but verify. It is not a phrase for the suspicious. It is the operating principle of everyone who has learned that the most reliable information about a person's future behavior is their past behavior, tested against reality rather than simply taken at their word. Together, these first three signs, vesting, longevity, and reliability, form the foundation of the framework you are building. They tell you whether someone sees their interests as genuinely connected to yours, whether they perceive your relationship as something worth protecting into the future, and whether they have the real-world capacity to follow through on what they commit to. Each of these questions, answered with genuine data rather than hopeful assumption, changes the quality of every relationship you build. And collectively, they begin to give you something that most people never quite have: the ability to choose your alliances with clarity, to invest your trust with purpose, and to build a life surrounded by people whose behavior you can genuinely predict. The remaining signs go deeper still. They take you inside the way someone communicates, the way they act under pressure, and the way their emotional life shapes or limits everything they do. But the foundation is here. And foundations, when they are solid, are what allow everything else to stand. Chapter 4. Vesting. The first commitment. There is a force that drives almost every durable alliance in human life, every partnership that holds through difficulty, every friendship that shows up uninvited when things go wrong, every professional relationship that generates something greater than the sum of its parts. It is not affection, though affection can accompany it. It is not shared values, though aligned values can reinforce it. It is not even mutual respect, as important as respect is to the texture of any good relationship. The force that actually drives durable alliance is something more specific, more structural, and more powerful than any of those things. It is the belief, genuine, personal, visceral, that your success is my success. This is what behavioral scientists call vesting. And once you understand how it works, the way you read every important relationship in your life will change. Start by setting aside the word selfless. We live in a culture that celebrates selflessness as the highest form of loyalty. The idea that the truly committed person cares about you without any consideration of what they gain from the relationship. It is a beautiful ideal, and there are moments when something close to it is real. But as the foundation of a prediction system, as the thing you watch for to determine whether someone will reliably show up for you, selflessness is essentially useless. You cannot verify it, you cannot sustain it under pressure. And when it is performed rather than felt, when someone is being generous in the ways they want to be seen as generous rather than in the ways you actually need, it produces a kind of false warmth that looks exactly like genuine support until the moment of real cost arrives. What you can verify, what to sustain under pressure, and what produces reliable behavior in the people around you is interest. Specifically, the perception, held by the other person, not just by you, that investing in your success is also investing in their own. This is not a cynical observation about human nature. It is a clarifying one. It does not reduce genuine connection to calculation. It simply acknowledges that the most durable form of loyalty is loyalty that has roots, that grows from real soil rather than from the evanescent warmth of goodwill that has not been tested by cost. Consider a person who has staked their professional reputation on the project you are leading. They have publicly associated their name with its outcome. Their colleagues know they are involved. Their bosses are watching to see how it goes. In this situation, the alignment between their success and yours is not theoretical. It is structural, and it is felt. That person is going to show up. They are going to push through obstacles they might otherwise avoid. They are going to solve problems on your behalf, not because they are unusually principled, but because your problem is now also their problem, and solving it serves both of you. This is vesting in its most concentrated form, and it produces a quality of reliability that goodwill alone almost never generates. Now contrast that with someone who likes you, genuinely wishes you well, and has no structural connection to your outcomes. They are rooting for you in the way you root for a team you follow, from a comfortable distance that does not require them to sacrifice anything. When things are going well, their support feels real because it costs nothing and their goodwill is sincere. But the moment your success requires something from them, their time, their social capital, their willingness to take a risk on your behalf, the equation changes. Not because they are dishonest, but because they were never structurally vested in the first place. Their investment in you was emotional, and emotions shift with context. Vesting is different. It creates a material connection that holds even when the emotional warmth fluctuates. This is why learning to recognize vesting and to distinguish it from the warmer but less durable forms of connection is one of the most practically valuable skills you can develop. The first thing to understand is that vesting communicates itself through behavior, and specifically through a particular kind of unsolicited behavior. Someone who is genuinely vested in your success does not wait to be asked before they help. They see an opportunity that benefits you, and they move on it because moving on it also serves them. They call in favors on your behalf because they understand that your ability to succeed will eventually generate something they value. They speak about you in rooms you don't occupy, building your reputation because your reputation reflects on theirs, and because they have come to see the space between your success and their own as narrower than the space between strangers. Pay attention to initiative because it is one of the most reliable signals available. There is a profound difference between someone who helps you when you ask and someone who helps you before you ask. The first kind of support is responsive. It tells you that someone is basically cooperative and not unkind. The second kind is generative. It tells you that someone is actively thinking about your interests even when you are not present to remind them. That difference is the difference between a friendly acquaintance and a genuine ally. Another crucial signal of vesting is the way someone responds to your success. Genuine vesting produces authentic, unguarded enthusiasm when you win. Not the polite, slightly restrained congratulation of someone who is managing the complexity of seeing you do well while navigating their own feelings about it, but real, uncomplicated pleasure that has no edge to it. Because when someone is genuinely vested in your success, your win is also their win, and celebrating it does not require any generosity of spirit. It is simply natural. Conversely, the subtle presence of a guarded quality in someone's response to your achievements, the almost imperceptible hesitation, the congratulation that arrives with a faint undercurrent of distance, is worth noting. It does not always mean something significant, but patterns of guarded response to your success, especially in moments when enthusiasm would be easy, are worth taking seriously. Watch also for the way people speak when talking about your shared future. Language is one of the most revealing dimensions of vesting. People who are genuinely invested in your continued success tend to speak in terms that implicitly include you, we, our, when we get to that point, rather than language that keeps you and them in separate categories. This linguistic inclusion is not something most people engineer consciously. It emerges naturally from the way they perceive the relationship, and its presence or absence is a remarkably honest signal of whether they see your trajectories as linked or parallel. There are also signals of what vesting looks like when it is absent, and reading these negative signs with the same care you bring to the positive ones is just as important. When someone consistently positions you as different from them, emphasizing the ways your approach, your background, or your methods diverge from theirs, they are signaling, often unconsciously, that the psychological gap between their interests and yours feels wide. When someone is enthusiastically available for conversations about their own goals but conspicuously less engaged when yours are on the table, the asymmetry is telling you something. When someone's generosity toward you is reliably contingent on the presence of an audience. When they are most visibly supportive in moments that make them look good, but less evident in the quiet, costly moments when support would require something without witnesses, the pattern reveals the limits of what they actually feel. None of these signals encountered once constitute a conclusion. People have bad days. People are distracted by their own pressures. People fail to express their support in ways that land clearly. What you are building is a body of data, a pattern across multiple interactions, multiple contexts, multiple tests of whether the alliance holds not just when it is easy, but when it costs something. The pattern is what matters. Now consider the reciprocal dimension of vesting, because it may be the most important thing in this entire chapter. The same dynamic that determines whether others are vested in you also determines how much you are vested in them. And the quality of your own vesting shapes your relationships just as powerfully as theirs does. If you want to be surrounded by people who are genuinely invested in your success, the most direct path to that is to genuinely invest in theirs. Not as a strategy, not as a tactic, not as a calculated attempt to generate loyalty through the appearance of generosity, but as an actual orientation toward the people around you, one in which you look for real ways to connect your interests with theirs, real ways to contribute to outcomes that matter to them, real ways to be a resource rather than simply a colleague. When you do this consistently, something remarkable tends to happen. The people whose success you have invested yourself in start to think about your success differently. Not because you have somehow manipulated them into loyalty, but because genuine vesting is one of the most reciprocal forces in human behavior. It creates the same conditions in others that it emerges from. It demonstrates that cooperation is real and that the alliance has weight. And over time, it changes the quality of your professional and personal environment in ways that no amount of charm or networking can replicate. Think about the difference between a workplace where everyone is quietly protecting their own territory, their own credit, their own visibility, their own advancement, and a workplace where people are genuinely invested in each other's outcomes. Both environments can contain people of comparable skill and comparable goodwill. The difference is not in the character of the individuals. It is in the culture of vesting that has or has not been established, and that culture is created not by a policy or a value statement, but by the cumulative behavior of the individuals within it, by whether those individuals have decided person by person to actually tie their success to the success of the people around them. This is perhaps the deepest truth about vesting. It is not something you simply find in others. It is something you help create by being the kind of person who invests themselves genuinely in the outcomes of the people they work and live alongside. The alliances that result from that kind of mutual investment are not just more reliable. They are qualitatively different, richer, more resilient, and capable of sustaining the kind of pressure that exposes the weakness of every relationship built on less stable ground. One more thing deserves to be said about vesting, and it is the thing that most people miss. The belief that someone's success will benefit you does not need to be large or dramatic to be powerful. You do not need a heroic, cross-the-burning-bridge alliance to experience the benefits of genuine vesting. You need relationships in your workplace, your community, your personal life, where the connection between your flourishing and theirs is real enough to be felt. Even modestly, even partially, even in limited domains. What matters is that the connection exists, and that both of you know it does. Because when that connection is present, even quietly, even without a name, something shifts. The other person stops being someone you work with or live alongside and starts being someone whose success you are actually rooting for. And when people root for each other in that real, invested way, the quality of everything they build together changes. That is the power of the first commitment. And everything else in the framework of reading people rests, in part, on understanding it. Chapter 5. Longevity. Playing the long game. There is a kind of trust that forms quickly, almost without effort. The kind that arises between two people who instantly recognize something familiar in each other, who find themselves speaking with an ease and openness that usually takes months to develop. It feels powerful when it happens. It carries a charge of excitement and the pleasant sense of having found something rare. And it is real in its own way. The connection is genuine. The goodwill is authentic. But by itself, it is fragile. Not because the people involved are not sincere, but because sincerity and durability are different things, and what makes a relationship truly sturdy enough to hold weight when things get difficult is something that cannot be felt in a first meeting, however wonderful that meeting might be. What makes a relationship sturdy is time. More specifically, it is the perception of time, the shared understanding between two people that their connection has a future, that the consequences of how they treat each other today will echo forward into months and years and encounters that have not yet happened. This is the second of the 6 signs of behavior prediction, and in some ways it is the most quietly powerful of all. The belief, held by the person whose behavior you are trying to predict, that the two of you will be in each other's lives for a long time. When that belief is present, everything changes. The entire behavioral calculation shifts. Think about the last time you found yourself in a relationship that you knew was temporary, a short-term project with a colleague you would never see again afterward, a business interaction with a vendor you are unlikely to work with in the future, a professional conference where you met people you'd probably never encounter again. In those contexts, how carefully did you manage the relationship? How much did the other person's opinion of you genuinely affect your behavior? How much did you restrain yourself from small acts of self-interest that you might not have indulged in with someone you knew would still be around next year? Most people, if they are honest, will admit that the texture of their behavior in relationships they perceive as short is subtly different, a little less careful, a little more self-serving at the margins, a little less concerned with the impression they leave. This is not a moral failing. It is a predictable response to incentive structure. When the future is short, the consequences of any given behavior are limited. When the future is long, those consequences compound across time, which means that the motivation to behave well, to show up reliably, to protect the relationship and the trust within it is proportionally greater. People who believe they will be dealing with you for years have a stake in the relationship that people who think they'll be dealing with you for weeks simply do not. That stake is one of the most reliable forces for trustworthy behavior that exists. This is why, if you want to predict how someone will treat you, one of the most important questions you can ask is not, what kind of person are they, in the abstract, but how long do they think we will know each other? Because character, as important as it is, operates within context, and the time horizon of a relationship is one of the most powerful contextual forces shaping how that character expresses itself toward you. Consider what this looks like at the extreme ends. A person who believes they will never see you again has almost no incentive, apart from their own internal code, to behave well toward you. If that internal code is strong, they will, but the external incentive structure provides no reinforcement. Contrast this with someone who knows, because of professional circumstances, shared community, or simply the nature of their connection to you, that they will be sitting across from you in 5 years. Every way they treat you today is a down payment on a relationship they will still be living inside in the future. The cost of betraying your trust is not just the immediate loss of the relationship. It is the long, slow accumulation of every interaction that follows in its shadow. The perception of a long relationship also changes something deeper than just behavior. It changes investment. When people see their connection with you as long-term, they begin investing in it the way they invest in anything they expect to still be using in the future. They share more of themselves. They learn more about you. They build the kind of layered understanding of each other that takes time to accumulate and cannot be replicated in short interactions. The relationship develops depth, and that depth is itself a form of security for both of you. It creates a shared history that neither party wants to compromise, and a shared future that both parties have a genuine stake in protecting. There is a related principle here that goes beyond the natural development of long relationships, the fact that you can influence how long a relationship feels even before time has actually passed. This is one of the more remarkable findings in behavioral science and one of the most practically useful. The perception of a long relationship is partly a function of actual duration, but only partly. It is also a function of the depth and quality of what is shared within the relationship, the degree to which both people have genuinely invested themselves, and the explicit signals each sends about their expectation of the future. When you communicate, through your behavior and your language and your genuine engagement, that you see this person as someone who will be in your life for a long time, something shifts in how they experience the relationship. The future becomes real to them in a way it was not before. And with that reality comes the sense of accountability, the feeling that this relationship has a value worth protecting, that generates the trustworthy behavior you are looking for. This means that one of the most effective things you can do in any important relationship is to make the future feel tangible, not by making promises you cannot keep or by performing a kind of false intimacy, but by genuinely investing yourself in the relationship's continuity, by following through on things, by remembering what matters to the other person, by creating traditions and rituals that give the relationship a recurring rhythm, by speaking in terms that include the other person in your future thinking. These behaviors signal clearly and authentically that you see the relationship as something worth building, and they tend to generate the same perception in return. The positive signs that someone sees your relationship as long are some of the most meaningful you can receive in any context. They include you in conversations about their long-term goals, genuinely, not performatively. They create and maintain shared rituals, the recurring lunch, the annual check-in, the habit of reaching out at meaningful moments that accumulates over time into a texture of ongoing connection. They speak about you in the future tense, as part of what is coming, not just what has been. They invest in your development, sharing resources and opportunities and networks that only make sense if they expect you to be around long enough for the investment to pay off. They use language that implicitly places you inside the relationship's future. When we do this, as we move forward, I'd love for us to work on that together, rather than language that keeps you at arm's length in the present tense. They also, and this is perhaps the most underrated signal of all, make you feel genuinely irreplaceable. Not through flattery is cheap and often empty, but through the way they structure their work and life around the assumption that you are specifically and uniquely valuable to them. When someone treats you as if your absence would leave a real gap, not just any gap that could be filled by the next qualified person, they are telling you something important about how they experience your place in their world. Read the negative signs with equal attention. Someone who cannot remember details about you across repeated interactions, who treats each encounter as essentially fresh rather than continuous, is demonstrating, without intending to, that the relationship does not have much of a past for them, which is a reliable signal that it does not have much of a future in their minds either. Someone who speaks about your role, your involvement, your contribution in terms that feel contingent or temporary, for now, while you're here, at this stage, is communicating something about the time horizon they see. Someone who does not initiate contact, who lets the relationship be entirely dependent on your maintenance of it, who never reaches across the gap to deepen or extend the connection, is someone for whom the relationship is not a priority in the way that long-term investments are priorities. None of these signals are damning in isolation. People are busy. People have their own pressures. The absence of a particular behavior on a particular day is not evidence of anything. But across time, across repeated interactions, across the cumulative pattern of how someone engages with the relationship, the picture that forms is real and informative. And the pattern of someone who consistently behaves as though the future of your relationship is not something they are actively building is a pattern worth taking seriously. There is also something important here about the relationship between longevity and vulnerability. When people believe a relationship will be long, they gradually take down their guard in ways they cannot do in short relationships. They share more of themselves, their concerns, their ambitions, their uncertainties, the parts of their life that are not performance ready. This vulnerability is not a liability in long relationships. It is a form of deepening that makes the relationship richer and more resilient. It also creates a kind of mutual exposure that bonds people in a way that careful self-presentation never can. When you know someone's vulnerabilities and they know yours, the relationship has a weight and a realness that surface-level connection simply cannot match. This is one of the reasons that the best professional and personal alliances in life tend to be the long ones, not just because they have had time to develop reliability, but because the accumulated depth of genuine mutual knowledge creates a foundation that is genuinely difficult to replicate. When something goes wrong, and in any long relationship something will go wrong, that foundation is what allows the relationship to absorb the shock. Short relationships break at the first significant collision. Long ones, when they are built on real investment, bend without breaking. The deepest lesson of this sign is simple, but it has implications that extend through every important relationship in your life. The future you create for a relationship is as much a product of how you treat it today as it is of any natural unfolding of time. People who play the long game in their relationships, who invest before they need to, who show up consistently before the moment of crisis, who build the kind of sustained, demonstrated commitment that makes the future feel real and shared, tend to find themselves, years later, surrounded by the kind of alliances that hold up through anything. And people who are always looking for the quick return, who treat relationships as transactions to be closed rather than connections to be built, who are fully present only when they need something, those people tend to find themselves years later alone in ways they never expected, because the relationships that matter most in life are almost never the ones that were convenient. They are the ones that were tended. Chapter 6. Reliability. Competence meets consistency. There is a particular kind of disappointment that most people experience at some point in their professional or personal lives, one that is different from betrayal, different from deception, and in some ways harder to process than either. It is the disappointment of someone who meant to come through for you and simply could not. Someone who made their commitment in good faith, who genuinely believed they were capable of keeping it, who perhaps even worked hard trying to keep it, and still left you holding the weight of an unfulfilled promise. It is the disappointment of unreliability, and it stings in its own particular way because there is no one clear to blame, no obvious moment of malice to point to. There is only the gap between what was promised and what was delivered, and the slow, uncomfortable realization that you built something on a foundation that could not hold it. Reliability is the third of the 6 signs, and in some ways it is the most operationally important of all. Because whatever someone's intentions are toward you, however vested they may be in your success, however long they believe the relationship will last, none of it becomes real in your life unless they can actually follow through. Intention without execution is noise. Goodwill without competence is sentiment. The question that reliability asks is the most practical question available to anyone who is trying to assess another person. Can they actually do what they say they will? And will they? The answer to that question is always made of 2 separate things, and the first mistake most people make is treating it as if it were one. The 2 components are competence and diligence, and they are not interchangeable. They are not even closely related. A person can have one in abundance and be almost entirely without the other. And in either case, the result for anyone counting on them is the same: failure to deliver. Competence is the capacity to do something. It is skill, knowledge, experience, the hard-won ability to perform a specific task at a level that produces real results. Competence is what it looks like when someone has genuinely mastered what they do, not to their own satisfaction, which is an unreliable standard, but to the measurable standard of actual outcomes. Competence is why you trust a surgeon to perform surgery and not a brilliant accountant who has read extensively about surgery and feels confident about it. The feeling of confidence, as it turns out, is not the same thing as the fact of competence. And the gap between those 2 things, between a person's belief in their own capabilities and the actual observable quality of their performance, is one of the most common sources of unreliability in human relationships. Most people, if they are honest, overestimate their own competence in at least some areas. This is not a character flaw. It is a nearly universal feature of human psychology, documented so consistently across so many different domains that researchers have given it multiple names and dedicated entire fields of study to understanding it. We are not good at objectively evaluating our own abilities, in part because the same skills required to evaluate performance are often the skills that performance itself draws on, which means that people who lack a skill also frequently lack the ability to accurately assess their own deficiency in it. The result is a world full of people who believe, sincerely and without malice, that they can do things they cannot actually do. This is why watching what people have actually done, verified insofar as possible through sources other than themselves, matters so much more than listening to what they say they can do. A conversation about someone's past performance is the least reliable source of information about that performance precisely because it is conducted by the most interested party. A resume is written to impress. An interview is a performance. References are selected because they will speak well. None of these are useless, but all of them require a corrective lens, the lens of actual observable evidence of what this person has genuinely accomplished in conditions that required real skill, under real pressure, with real consequences for failure. Diligence is a different thing entirely. It is the quality of sustained, disciplined effort, the willingness to show up consistently, to push through difficulty, To follow a task from beginning to actual completion rather than from beginning to the point where it becomes uncomfortable or boring or requires the kind of grinding work that competent people sometimes believe they are too capable to perform. Diligence is what separates a person who can do something from a person who will do it repeatedly, reliably, even when the conditions are not ideal and no one is watching to see if they cut corners. And if you think competence is underestimated as a predictor of reliability, diligence is even more so. Because diligence is harder to see in advance, harder to fake convincingly over time, and, critically, more commonly absent than most people want to believe. Research suggests that roughly half of all working people operate at a level of engagement with their work that falls well short of what genuine diligence requires. They are present. They are not absent in a way that is technically notable. But they are going through the motions in a way that produces reliable results only when the task itself does not demand more, when the task gets harder, when the deadline gets tighter, when the project hits the inevitable patch of unglamorous difficulty that requires sustained effort over days or weeks without external reward or recognition. That is when the absence of diligence becomes visible, and that is exactly when reliability matters most. The particular challenge with both of these qualities is that they are difficult to assess quickly and easy to mistake for each other or for their substitutes. Confidence is not competence. Enthusiasm is not diligence. The person who walks into a room exuding the calm certainty of someone who has done this 1,000 times may be genuinely experienced, or may simply have the kind of personality that defaults to projected confidence, regardless of the underlying substance. The person who seems energized and eager at the start of a project may carry that energy through to completion, or may be the kind of person who is extraordinary at beginnings and struggles with the discipline of following through. This is why the behavioral approach to assessing reliability is anchored in specifics rather than impressions. Not how confident someone seems, but what specific things they have done that required real skill and what the verifiable outcomes were. Not how enthusiastic someone appears about a commitment, but what their track record looks like when you examine it across multiple commitments over real time. Not how they describe their approach to difficult problems, but what you can learn about how they actually behaved when a difficult problem landed in their lap with no warning and no comfortable option. Reliable people, when you know what to look for, communicate their reliability through consistent patterns of behavior. They speak in specifics rather than generalities. Not because they have been coached to do so, but because people with genuine competence have actual concrete knowledge to draw on, and that knowledge expresses itself naturally in the particulars rather than the abstractions. They are transparent about what they do not know and what they cannot do, because people who are genuinely skilled understand the boundaries of their skill, while people who are less skilled, and particularly those who are dangerously unaware of how less skilled they are, tend to have a much harder time naming their limitations. Reliable people are also willing to take on the unglamorous work. They do not measure their contribution by the visibility of their effort or the drama of their sacrifice. They measure it by whether the job is done well. They finish what they start. They meet their deadlines without making the deadlines themselves into a performance. They accept responsibility when something goes wrong without searching for a narrative in which someone else bears the weight of their shortfall. And they do all of this not because they are performing virtue, but because they genuinely understand that the purpose of their involvement in any project or relationship is to deliver, not to look like someone who could deliver if only the conditions were more favorable. One of the most reliable tells of genuine competence is the way someone handles the moment when things go wrong. Because things always go wrong. In any complex task, in any sustained relationship, in any project that extends over real time and requires real effort, there will be moments of failure, problems that were not anticipated, commitments that could not be met, outcomes that fall short of what was promised. How someone handles those moments is one of the clearest windows you will ever have into their character and their actual capacity. A genuinely reliable person acknowledges the failure cleanly, without embellishment and without excuse-making. They explain what happened, not as a defense, but as information. They focus immediately on what can be done rather than on managing your perception of why things went wrong, and they take responsibility in a way that is not performative but practical, meaning they change something about their approach so that the same failure does not recur in the same form. The person who responds to failure by searching immediately for the explanation that distributes the blame most favorably by constructing a narrative in which the failure was not really their fault, or was inevitable, or was caused by factors outside their control that they happened to be caught in the middle of, is a person whose reliability you should seriously question. Not because they are necessarily dishonest, but because their primary orientation at the moment of failure is toward managing their self-image rather than solving the problem. And a person whose primary orientation is toward managing their self-image will always, at some level, prioritize that over the actual follow-through that reliability requires. The negative signals of unreliability are equally worth learning because they tend to appear long before the actual moment of failure, and noticing them early gives you time to adjust. The person who is hard to reach when there is not something in it for them. The person who is chronically late, not occasionally and with good reason, but consistently and without apparent concern, because chronic lateness is one of the most reliable tells available, revealing simultaneously a lack of consideration for other people's time and a level of disorganization that almost always extends into the work itself. The person who speaks in generalities when asked for specifics, who changes the subject when you ask for documentation, whose version of events shifts subtly across retellings in ways they may not even notice. And then there is the person who means well but simply cannot, who is so committed to the image of themselves as someone who can, that they make commitments they cannot possibly keep, generating disappointment not through malice, but through the particular kind of self-deception that optimism, when it is untethered from realistic self-assessment, can produce. With all of these people, the principle is the same: verify, not as an act of distrust, but as an act of respect, for the reality of what a commitment actually requires, and for the relationship enough to want it to rest on something solid. The most generous thing you can do for anyone you are considering relying on is to check, carefully and without apology, whether the foundation of that reliance is actually there. Because a commitment you build on real data about real capability is one that has a chance to hold, and one built on the comfortable assumption that goodwill is enough to substitute for what goodwill cannot actually provide. Competence and diligence, both present, both verifiable, is one waiting for the moment when the pressure arrives to reveal what it is actually made of. Trust, but verify, not sometimes, every time. Chapter 7. Actions. The truest language. Everything a person has ever said about themselves is interesting. Some of it is even true. But in the project of understanding who someone actually is, not who they believe themselves to be, not who they want you to believe they are, not who they might become under ideal circumstances, there is one category of information that tells you more than everything else combined, not their words, not their intentions, not the values they claim and the principles they profess. What tells you the most about a person, always, is what they actually do. Actions are the fourth sign of behavioral prediction, and in many ways they are the most unforgiving, precisely because they are the hardest to manufacture and the hardest to sustain as performance. You can rehearse an interview, you can craft an email, you can present yourself in curated high-stakes moments as someone whose values and capabilities far exceed what your daily behavior actually reflects. But the accumulation of ordinary actions across ordinary days, in ordinary pressures and temptations, that accumulation does not lie. It is what you are, rendered visible. The most important thing to understand about actions as a predictor is that they operate at two levels, and both matter. The first is patterns, the recurring, consistent behaviors that reveal a person's character as a kind of standing policy, the way they tend to act when circumstances are roughly normal and no extraordinary pressure is forcing them toward their best or worst. The second is current behavior, which is frequently underrated because it lacks the authority that a long track record seems to carry. And yet current behavior, especially behavior in a situation that resembles the one you're navigating together now, is almost always more predictive than behavior from years ago under different pressures and different incentives. Both levels must be read, and neither should be substituted for the other. Someone's past patterns give you the bones of their character, the stable infrastructure of their values and habits that tends to persist even when circumstances change. But the present is where the relevant stakes are, and present behavior is the best window you have into how someone's character is actually functioning right now, in the circumstances you currently share with them. Character is not a fixed property. It is expressed within context, shaped by pressure, tested by temptation, and sometimes revealed most clearly not by what someone does when things are going well, but by what they do when things get hard. This is one of the reasons that the power paradox deserves to be taken seriously. There is a pattern, documented across countless contexts, in which people who have operated with genuine integrity under conditions of accountability begin to show different behavior when accountability decreases. When someone moves into a role where their decisions are less visible, less scrutinized, less subject to consequence, when they have more power and less oversight, the behavior that their character produces under those new conditions is sometimes startlingly different from what the record of their earlier behavior would have predicted. This is not random. It reflects a truth about human character that is uncomfortable but important. Character is partly stable and partly situational, and the situations that test it most reliably are the ones where the cost of failing is lowest and the temptation is highest. This does not mean that people cannot be trusted. It means that trust extended without verification is always a bet, and the probability of that bet paying off changes with context. The most trustworthy prediction you can make is not, "This person has always been honest, therefore they will be honest now." It is, "This person has demonstrated consistent honesty across a range of contexts, including contexts where being honest cost them something, and nothing in the current situation suggests that the incentive structure has changed in ways that would alter their behavior." That is a much more specific and much more reliable prediction. Learning to read actions accurately requires developing several specific habits of observation, the first of which is the discipline of looking at what people do rather than what they say. This sounds obvious, and people acknowledge it readily as an abstract principle, but in practice it is surprisingly difficult to maintain the distinction. Words are easy to produce and easy to receive. When someone speaks with conviction about their commitment to honesty, their dedication to the people they work with, their willingness to show up in difficult moments, something in us responds to that conviction, and the emotional reality of the communication begins to shade our perception of the behavioral reality it is describing. We start to feel slightly as though we have evidence of trustworthy behavior, when what we actually have is evidence of convincing speech. The antidote is to develop the habit of asking always what the behavioral evidence is. Not, "Does this person say they are reliable?" but "What have they actually done in verifiable circumstances that would allow me to form a picture of their reliability?" Not, "Does this person claim to be loyal?" but "What have they done in moments when loyalty was costly?" Not, "Does this person present themselves as someone who takes responsibility?" but "When something went wrong that was partly or fully their responsibility, what did they actually do?" These are harder questions to answer because they require more information and more time, but they are the questions whose answers are actually predictive. One of the most reliable patterns in the behavioral tell system is consistency across different types of relationships. People who treat those with power over them differently from those beneath them, who perform generosity and respect for the people they are trying to impress while revealing impatience, dismissiveness, or condescension toward people who cannot offer them anything, are showing you something important about where their behavior comes from. It comes from calculation rather than character. And calculation changes when the equation changes. The person who is charming to you while you are useful and cool toward you when you are not is showing you as clearly as possible that your experience of their warmth is contingent on factors you do not fully control. That is not a safe foundation for any relationship that matters. The same principle applies to consistency across roles. Someone who is a different person in their personal and professional life, who treats family members or close friends in ways that would be considered unacceptable in any professional setting, or who behaves professionally in ways that contradict the values they claim in personal conversations, is demonstrating an instability of character that matters regardless of which version of them you primarily encounter, because under sufficient pressure, the version you see may not be the version you get. The consistency of stories over time is another remarkably reliable tell. When someone recounts an event, something that happened at work, a conflict they navigated, a decision they made, the version they tell you should not vary substantially from one telling to the next, or from the version you might obtain from others who were present. Memory is imperfect, and small inconsistencies are normal. But when the major elements of a story shift, when the level of their own responsibility changes, when the other people involved are characterized differently, when the outcome they describe does not match what can be verified, that inconsistency is information. Honest people tell stories that are stable because they are describing something that actually happened. People who are managing a narrative produce versions that tend to drift in the direction of whatever makes them look best in the current conversation. The willingness to acknowledge mistakes is one of the clearest windows into character available to anyone trying to read another person. Not the performance of acknowledging mistakes, the practiced "I want to take full responsibility for this," that is followed immediately by an elaborate explanation of all the factors that made the mistake inevitable, but the actual, uncomplicated acceptance of responsibility that says, "This was my shortcoming, and here is what I am doing differently." People who can do this cleanly are almost always easier to work with, more reliably trustworthy, and ultimately more competent than people who cannot. Because the ability to accept responsibility without defensiveness requires a level of self-security that tends to correlate with all the other qualities that make someone genuinely reliable. And the inability to accept responsibility, the impulse to immediately construct a narrative that distributes the blame more favorably, is a warning signal that extends beyond the specific situation. It suggests a person whose primary orientation, when things go wrong, is toward protecting their self-image rather than solving the problem. Loyalty under fire is another of the most revealing behavioral tells available. It is easy to be loyal to someone when loyalty costs nothing, when they are in good standing, when associating with them is comfortable and socially safe, when supporting them aligns with everyone's interests. The test of loyalty is the moment when it costs something, when the person being loyal takes a position on your behalf that others disagree with, when they speak well of you in a room where others are speaking critically, when they absorb some discomfort or risk or social friction in order to stand in your corner. These moments are rare because most people avoid them unless their character and their investment in the relationship are strong enough to override the pull towards self-preservation. But when they happen, they are among the most reliable signals of genuine alliance that exist. The behaviors that signal the absence of trustworthy character are equally worth learning to read, and they tend to appear long before the dramatic moment of actual betrayal. The person who deflects questions about their past, not occasionally when the question is genuinely intrusive, but consistently when the information asked for is entirely reasonable, is a person with something to hide, and something hidden that's significantly enough to justify sustained avoidance is rarely something small. The person who speaks about past colleagues and relationships with consistent negativity, who has an explanation for why every prior boss was inadequate, every prior partnership ended through someone else's failing, every significant rupture in their history was primarily the other party's fault, is a person whose relationship with accountability is troubled in ways that will eventually express themselves in their relationship with you. The person whose behavior is markedly inconsistent, who is warm and then cold without clear reason, generous in one context and withholding in another, transparent on some subjects and opaque on others that seem equally open, is a person whose underlying motivations are complex enough to produce unpredictability, and unpredictability is the thing you are working hardest to eliminate. None of these signs, encountered once, is definitive. What you are building as you gather data about the people who matter in your life is a pattern. A picture that forms across multiple observations, multiple contexts, multiple tests of whether what someone does matches what they say. That picture, when it is allowed to form with patience and without the distortion of wishful thinking, is the most reliable guide you will ever have to what someone is actually going to do when the moment that matters finally arrives. Because the moment that matters always arrives. And the person who is there for it is not the one who said the right things in the easy moments. It is the one whose actions, accumulated across all the ordinary days that preceded it, made their presence predictable. Chapter 8. Language. Every word is a tell. Before someone shows you who they are through their actions, they reveal it through their words. Not in the dramatic, obvious ways, not the outright lie or the clumsy self-promotion that announces itself immediately, but in the quieter, more persistent patterns of how someone communicates, what they choose to talk about, how they respond when challenged, whether their language centers on you or on themselves, whether their body agrees with what their mouth is saying, whether they speak to build understanding or to win. Language is the most accessible of all the 6 signs because it is always present. And because it is always present, most people have learned not to listen to it with any real care. This is one of the most costly mistakes in the project of reading people accurately. We treat language as the vehicle for the content someone is trying to convey. We listen for the information and ignore the medium, but the medium is itself an extraordinary source of information. How someone speaks, what they choose to emphasize, where they become evasive or defensive or suddenly more animated. All of this reveals things about a person's character, their emotional state, their relationship with truth, and their orientation toward the people they are speaking with. Every conversation is, in this sense, 2 conversations happening simultaneously, the one being conducted openly and the one being conducted by the language patterns themselves. The person who learns to hear both is operating with a level of understanding that most people simply do not have. The first and most foundational thing to understand about the language of trust is what it is oriented toward. Trustworthy language, the language of someone who is genuinely invested in the relationship and in your well-being, centers on you rather than on themselves. This seems simple. It is not. Most human communication defaults, naturally and without malice, toward the speaker. We talk about what interests us, what we have accomplished, what we believe, what we have experienced. Studies across multiple decades have consistently found that roughly half of everything most people say is about themselves. Not because they are selfish in any profound moral sense, but because our own inner life is the most immediately available subject matter we have. The impulse to share ourselves is human and understandable. But the person who can genuinely redirect their attention outward, who finds you more interesting than they find themselves in that moment, who asks more than they tell, who listens with the kind of focused, patient attention that makes you feel genuinely heard, is communicating something important through that orientation. They are demonstrating, through the structure of how they engage with you, that your experience and perspective matter to them. And they are creating the conditions under which trust is possible, because trust requires being known, and being known requires someone who is genuinely interested in knowing you. This is one of the reasons that the ability to listen is one of the most undervalued and most revealing qualities a person can have. Not performed listening, the nodding, the encouraging sounds, the appearance of engagement, but genuine listening, the kind where someone is actually trying to understand what you mean, not just waiting for their turn to speak. Genuine listeners ask follow-up questions that could only have been generated by actually hearing what you said. They remember what you told them and refer back to it in ways that show it registered. They sit with what you've shared before responding, rather than launching immediately into their own perspective. And they do all of this not because they have been coached to perform attentiveness, but because they are actually interested in you, in your experience, in understanding where you are coming from before forming their own response. The contrast with the person who is not really listening is stark once you know what you are looking for. The person who is waiting to speak rather than listening tends to jump to responses before you have fully finished your thought. They answer the surface of what you said rather than engaging with the substance. They frequently redirect the conversation back toward themselves within a few exchanges. Their follow-up questions, when they ask them at all, are often more about creating an opening for their own point than about deepening their understanding of yours. None of these behaviors are necessarily hostile, but they tell you clearly that the relationship this person is most interested in maintaining is with their own ideas, and that your role in the conversation is primarily as an audience. Pay attention to what people choose to talk about when the subject is not constrained. Conversation in relaxed, open-ended settings reveals priorities in ways that structured situations do not. The person who, given freedom to talk about anything, consistently returns to their own accomplishments, their own status, their own assessments of other people's shortcomings, is telling you something about where their attention lives. The person who asks about your life, your work, your challenges, your thinking, genuinely, with follow-through rather than perfunctory courtesy, is showing you something equally revealing. Not just that they are polite, but that their natural orientation is toward connection rather than performance. The way someone speaks about other people, particularly people who are not present, is one of the most reliable windows into their character. We reveal ourselves most fully when we talk about others, because in those moments the social scrutiny that governs our self-presentation is reduced. When we are describing someone else, we feel less observed and therefore less guarded. And what tends to come out is a genuine reflection of how we see the world, how much generosity we bring to the interpretation of other people's motives and mistakes, how quick we are to judge, how much pleasure we take in the details of other people's failures or difficulties. The person who speaks about absent colleagues and former partners with consistent negativity, who always seems to have been wronged, always seems to have been surrounded by people who were less capable or less principled than themselves, is demonstrating a relationship with the world that will eventually express itself toward you, not necessarily through malice, but through the same fundamental orientation that produces this pattern of judgment. And perhaps more practically, if someone speaks critically and casually about others to you, you can be certain they speak critically and casually about you to others. People who carry generous language for those who are absent carry it everywhere, including behind your back. The nonverbal dimension of language is where many of the most important reveals occur, precisely because it is the dimension that people control least consciously. The face is particularly expressive because the muscles that produce facial expressions are connected to the emotional centers of the brain in ways that make them genuinely difficult to fully manage under pressure. Genuine expressions tend to involve the whole face, eyes, brow, cheeks, and mouth moving together in coordination. Performed expressions are often more restricted, confined to one part of the face, or slightly mistimed relative to the words they are supposed to accompany. A smile that does not reach the eyes is different from one that does, and the distinction matters. Body language that contradicts verbal content is one of the most important signals available to you. When someone is saying something they genuinely believe and feel comfortable with, their body tends to be aligned with their words. Their posture open, their eye contact natural, their physical expression consistent with the emotional tone of what they are saying. When there is a disconnect, when someone is saying words of enthusiasm while their body is closed, or expressing confidence while the small muscles of the face are signaling tension, the body is usually the more honest of the two signals. Not always, because some people have physical habits that don't reflect their inner state, and some contexts produce physical anxiety that is unrelated to the conversation. But when the pattern of disconnected verbal and nonverbal communication appears consistently, across multiple contexts and multiple subjects, it is worth taking seriously. The way someone handles disagreement is another exceptionally revealing dimension of their language. There is a profound difference between someone who engages with a different perspective by genuinely trying to understand it, who can say, "That's an interesting way to think about it," and mean it, who can update their position when given good reason to, who treats disagreement as information rather than threat, and someone for whom any challenge to their view feels like an attack to be defended against. Defensive language, the impulse to explain, justify, deflect, or reframe any criticism rather than actually receive it, is a marker of insecurity, and insecurity is a marker of the kind of instability that makes behavior genuinely difficult to predict. The use of absolutes in speech is a subtler tell, but a consistent one. People who regularly speak in terms of always and never, who describe patterns as permanent, universal, and without exception, are communicating something about their relationship with nuance and complexity. Reality almost never operates in absolutes, and people who habitually express themselves that way are either genuinely failing to see the complexity of the situations they are describing, or they are reaching for rhetorical force at the expense of accuracy. In either case, the pattern suggests a kind of thinking that prioritizes emotional impact over careful observation. And people who prioritize emotional impact over careful observation in their language tend to do the same in their assessments of people and situations. The language of trust, in its positive form, has a recognizable quality to it even when you have not named all its components. It is easy to understand, not because its ideas are simple, but because the person saying it is genuinely trying to be clear rather than impressive. It makes you feel seen rather than evaluated. It focuses on your priorities and experiences rather than consistently redirecting toward the speaker's own. It engages with your ideas as ideas rather than as positions to be overcome. It is consistent, the same in private as in public, the same toward people with power as toward people without it. And it tends to leave you feeling more capable, more understood, and more willing to reciprocate rather than slightly diminished or vaguely outmaneuvered. That last quality, the feeling of having been left better rather than worse by an exchange, is perhaps the simplest and most reliable guide of all. Communication that builds the person it is directed toward, that creates understanding rather than confusion, that makes the relationship feel safer and more real rather than more performative. That is the language of someone whose orientation toward you is genuinely positive, and communication that consistently leaves you slightly less certain of yourself, slightly more indebted, slightly more aware of the speaker's superiority and your own inadequacy, however politely that effect is achieved, is the language of someone whose orientation toward you is primarily self-serving. Every word is a tell. The person who learns to hear them all, not just the content, but the patterns, the body, the silences, the consistency, the orientation, is the person who almost never has to be surprised by who someone turns out to be. Chapter 9. Stability, the foundation beneath everything. There is a kind of person most of us have encountered at some point in our lives whose presence in a relationship is like building on sand. They are not necessarily dishonest. They may be enormously talented. In their better moments, they can be warm, generous, even inspiring. And yet something about every alliance with them is somehow never quite solid, because the ground beneath it shifts in ways you cannot predict and cannot control, driven by an inner world that is too turbulent to allow for the consistency that genuine trust requires. One day the relationship feels strong, the next it is fragile in ways you do not understand. One day they are your strongest advocate, the next they are distant or defensive or inexplicably cold. You spend an enormous amount of energy trying to read the shifts, to manage the unpredictability, to hold the relationship together against a current that seems to work against it constantly. This is what it looks like to be in close orbit around someone who lacks emotional stability. And it is why the sixth sign, the deepest and in many ways most consequential of all, is not about what someone does or says in any particular moment, but about the underlying quality of their inner life that makes consistent, trustworthy behavior possible or impossible across all moments. Emotional stability is the foundation beneath everything else. The other 5 signs, vesting, longevity, reliability, actions, language, all depend on it. Without it, none of the others can be sustained. A person who is genuinely vested in your success, but who is emotionally unstable, will abandon that investment the moment their inner turbulence shifts them toward fear or self-protection. A person who intends to maintain a long relationship, but who lacks the emotional equilibrium to manage difficulty, will fracture it at the first significant conflict. A person who is competent and diligent under normal conditions, but who loses access to those qualities when stressed, which for the emotionally unstable is often, cannot be counted on in exactly the moments when you most need them to be. Emotional stability is the architecture that makes all the other good qualities in a person habitable. It is worth being precise about what emotional stability actually is, because it is easily confused with several things it is not. It is not the absence of feeling. People who are genuinely emotionally stable are not numb, not detached, not operating in some serene bubble of perpetual calm that insulates them from the normal range of human experience. They feel fear, frustration, disappointment, grief, the full spectrum of what it means to be human. What distinguishes them is not the absence of these experiences, but how those experiences are processed. Emotionally stable people feel what they feel without being captured by it. They can be angry without being governed by their anger. They can be afraid without being paralyzed by their fear. They can encounter difficulty without catastrophizing and encounter success without losing their perspective. Their emotional life does not leak uncontrollably into their behavior in ways that make them unpredictable to the people around them. This distinction matters enormously for the practical project of reading people, because emotional stability is not about the absence of struggle. It is about the relationship a person has developed with their own inner life. And that relationship expresses itself reliably across all the contexts you will share with someone, in how they respond to pressure, in how they treat people when things are not going their way, in whether their behavior toward you remains consistent across good times and hard ones, in whether you can predict them in the moments that matter. The deepest truth about emotional stability is rooted in a simple but profound understanding of the 2 most fundamental forces that drive human behavior. At the base of almost every emotional response, when you strip away the complexity and the context and the layered explanations, you find one of 2 things, love or fear. Not love in the narrow romantic sense, but love in the broadest possible sense. The orientation toward the world that is characterized by openness, generosity, appreciation, connection, and the genuine desire to contribute to the well-being of others and oneself. And fear in the equally broad sense. The orientation characterized by threat, scarcity, competition, defensiveness, and the need to protect and accumulate and guard against loss. Every other emotion, when traced to its root, is a version of one or the other. Anger, in its essential nature, is fear expressing itself aggressively. Jealousy is the fear of not having enough. Contempt is fear dressed as superiority. Greed is the fear of scarcity made into a behavioral policy. Cynicism is the fear of being hurt again, expressed as a preemptive refusal to believe. And on the other side, generosity is love with resources. Loyalty is love across time. Courage is love willing to pay a cost. Genuine confidence is love of oneself that does not require the diminishment of others. What makes this framework powerful for reading people is what it reveals about the emotional states that generate trustworthy versus untrustworthy behavior. Fear, in all its forms and disguises, drives unpredictability. When someone is operating primarily from a fear-based orientation, their behavior is shaped by the shifting landscape of what threatens them in any given moment, what they need to protect, what they stand to lose. That landscape changes constantly, and as it changes, so does their behavior toward you. Because you are always, in some sense, a variable in their threat assessment. Sometimes your presence is safe, sometimes it is not. Sometimes your success is compatible with theirs, sometimes it feels like it competes. Sometimes your needs align with what they can comfortably offer. Sometimes they do not. The fear-based person cannot maintain consistency toward you across all of these states because their behavior is not fundamentally organized around you. It is organized around their own shifting sense of safety and threat. Love, by contrast, generates the kind of stable orientation that makes consistent behavior possible. Not because people who operate from a love-based orientation are without self-interest. They absolutely are not. But because their self-interest is grounded in an understanding of their own worth that does not require other people to be diminished, and in a relationship with the world that is not primarily defensive. They do not experience your success as a potential threat to their own. They do not experience your needs as demands that compete with their security. They are not chronically monitoring the relationship for signs that they are getting a fair enough share. Their generosity does not dry up when they are under pressure because it flows from something that pressure does not easily touch. The most powerful single expression of love-based emotional orientation is appreciation. Genuine, freely offered appreciation for what is good in the world and in the people in it. And the most remarkable thing about appreciation from a neurological standpoint is that it is incompatible with fear. Not difficult to combine with fear, literally incompatible. You cannot be in a genuine state of appreciation and a genuine state of fear simultaneously. The brain does not allow it, which means that the degree to which someone's natural orientation is toward appreciation is also the degree to which they are resistant to the fear-based reactions that generate unpredictable behavior. This is why genuine appreciation, expressed not as performance but as a natural quality of how someone engages with the world, is one of the most reliable positive tells for emotional stability. People who are emotionally stable also tend to share a quality that is harder to name but immediately recognizable once you know what to look for, a fundamental comfort with themselves. Not self-satisfaction in the complacent sense, and not the performed confidence of someone trying to project strength they do not feel, but a settled relationship with their own identity that does not require external validation to remain intact. They can be criticized without being destabilized. They can fail without needing to rewrite the story of what happened. They can be in a room with people more accomplished than themselves without feeling diminished. And they can be in a room with people less accomplished than themselves without feeling the need to establish their superiority. This kind of inner settledness is enormously attractive and enormously practical because it means that the relationship they offer you is not burdened by the constant work of managing their sense of themselves. Their self-worth is not your project to maintain. The negative tells of emotional instability are worth learning as carefully as the positive ones, because they tend to appear in patterns that are recognizable long before the damaging behavior they predict actually arrives. The person who catastrophizes, who consistently amplifies the severity of ordinary problems, who speaks about challenges as if they are disasters, who experiences normal difficulty as crisis, is demonstrating a relationship with adversity that will inevitably produce behavior you cannot anticipate, because their behavioral responses are calibrated to a threat level that exists primarily in their perception. The person who consistently positions themselves as a victim, who has an explanation for every difficulty that centers on what was done to them rather than on what they can do, is revealing an orientation toward the world that makes them genuinely unreliable, not because they are dishonest, but because their sense of agency is so limited that they cannot be counted on to act rather than react. The person who oscillates dramatically between emotional extremes, who is in one moment effusively positive and warm, and in the next withdrawn, critical, or hostile without any change in circumstances that would explain the shift, is showing you the volatility that underlies their more appealing presentations. That volatility does not disappear when things matter. It intensifies. And the person who manipulates rather than communicates, who reaches for what they want through indirect pressure, guilt, strategic withdrawal, or the management of your perceptions rather than through honest expression of their needs, is someone whose emotional world has taught them that direct honesty is unsafe. Which means that every communication you receive from them is filtered through a layer of strategy, and you can never be quite certain what is genuinely meant and what is designed to produce a particular effect. Desperation is, in some ways, the single most dangerous state for trustworthy behavior. When someone is genuinely desperate, when they are under enough financial, emotional, or professional pressure that their sense of safety is severely compromised, the behavioral changes that result can be extreme. People who have demonstrated years of principled, consistent, admirable behavior can do things under genuine desperation that would seem completely incompatible with the character you thought you knew. This is not a reason to abandon everyone who faces difficulty, but it is a reason to pay close attention to the degree of pressure someone is under and to calibrate your trust accordingly. Character is real, but character operates within context, and the context of desperation is one in which character is most severely tested and most commonly found wanting. The emotionally stable person is recognizable not just in their good moments, but in their difficult ones. They navigate uncertainty without becoming unmoored. They handle criticism without becoming defensive or withdrawing. They experience conflict without treating it as an existential threat to the relationship. They can say, "I don't know," without embarrassment, and "I was wrong," without elaborate justification. They give generously without keeping score, and they receive generously without obligation. They are the same person in private that they are in public, and the same in difficulty that they are in ease. That consistency is not rigidity. Emotionally stable people are often highly flexible, able to adapt to changing circumstances without losing their core orientation. The consistency is deeper than that. It is a consistency of character expressed across all conditions, which is precisely what makes their behavior genuinely predictable. When you find this kind of person, and they exist in every walk of life, in every profession, at every level of success and every stage of life, you have found something worth protecting. Not just because they are pleasant to be around, though they often are, but because the foundation they offer any relationship is the most durable one available. An inner life that is stable enough to hold the weight of genuine trust across the full range of circumstances that real relationships encounter. You can build something real on that foundation, and what you build will hold. This is the sixth sign, and in many ways it is the one that makes all the others possible, because without the ground of emotional stability beneath it, even the most earnest vesting, the most promising longevity, the most impressive competence and diligence, the most consistent actions, and the most beautiful language in the world cannot produce the one thing that all of this has always been about, a relationship you can genuinely count on. Chapter 10. The Code of the Trustworthy Life. There is a question that lives beneath all of this, beneath the framework, beneath the signs, beneath everything you have learned about reading the people around you. And it is the question that matters most. Not who can you trust, but who are you becoming through the way you move through the world. Because the deepest truth embedded in everything we have explored together is this. The most reliable way to surround yourself with trustworthy people is to become a deeply trustworthy person yourself. Not as a strategy, not as a technique for attracting the right allies, but as the natural expression of a life that has been built, deliberately and with great care, on the qualities that make human beings genuinely knowable to each other. This is where the journey completes itself, and it is also where it begins again. You have spent the last 9 chapters learning to read others, to move through your relationships with the kind of clear-eyed systematic attention that allows you to gather real data rather than comfortable assumptions, to see patterns where before you saw only events, to distinguish genuine alliance from its convincing substitutes. That is an extraordinary skill. It will protect you from avoidable disappointment. It will help you invest your trust in people whose behavior you can actually count on. It will allow you to build professional and personal relationships on something more solid than the fog of first impressions and wishful thinking. But a framework for reading others, applied only outward, is incomplete, because the people who are trying to read you are using the same lenses, whether consciously or not, and what they see when they look at your behavior, your language, your consistency, your emotional orientation, your relationship to their success, will determine the quality of every alliance you are able to build. You are, at every moment, someone else's data. And the picture that data composes is the most important thing you can ever invest in, not because it determines how others see you, but because the process of building it changes who you actually are. Begin with vesting, not as the first of 6 signs to look for in others, but as a genuine personal commitment, the decision to actually invest yourself in the success of the people around you. This is harder than it sounds, because genuine vesting requires you to do something that our instinct for self-preservation often resists, to see your own flourishing as genuinely connected to the flourishing of others, and to act on that connection even when it costs you something. When you call in a favor for someone else, when you share credit rather than keep it, when you use your platform, your relationships, your reputation to build someone up rather than simply protecting and advancing your own position. When you do these things not because someone is watching, but because you have genuinely arrived at the understanding that your success and the success of the people around you are not in competition, that there is no version of a genuinely good life that is built on the dimming of others. The people who vest in others generously and consistently tend to find themselves at the center of networks of extraordinary mutual support, not because they engineered it, but because vesting is reciprocal in a way that almost nothing else is. When people know that you are genuinely invested in their success, they want to invest in yours, not out of obligation, but out of the natural human response to being genuinely seen and cared for. This reciprocity is not guaranteed, and it is not instantaneous, and some people you invest in will not invest back, which is itself important information. But across a life, the pattern is consistent. The person who invests most in others tends to be the person who is most richly invested in. Think about your relationship to time, not just as a sign to look for in others, but as something you embody in the relationships that matter to you. Do the important people in your life know, through your behavior rather than just your words, that you see your connection with them as long? Do you create the traditions, the recurring rituals, the small habits of continued presence that say, with every repetition, that this relationship has a future you are actively building? Do you speak about the people you care about in terms that include the future, in terms that place them inside what is coming, not just inside what has been? The perception of longevity is not passive. It is created by a sustained pattern of demonstrated investment, and it generates, in the people who feel it, the kind of accountability and care toward you that no short relationship ever can. Reliability, the third commitment, is in some ways the most humbling, because it requires an honest reckoning with the gap between your aspirations and your actual capacity. The most reliable people in any sphere of life are not necessarily the most talented. They are the people who have developed an accurate picture of what they can and cannot do, and who have built the discipline to consistently deliver what they promise within that picture. This requires the courage to say no when you genuinely cannot, even when saying yes would feel better in the moment. It requires the honesty to acknowledge when you are overpromising, even when the impulse to seem capable and willing is strong. It requires the willingness to follow through on commitments that have become inconvenient or difficult or no longer serve your immediate interest, because the person counting on you built something on the expectation that you would. Think about the last time you made a commitment that you did not keep. not because of a genuine emergency or an unavoidable circumstance, but because it became harder than you expected, or because something more appealing came along, or because you convinced yourself the other person would understand. Now consider what that experience communicated about you, not what you explained about it afterward, but what the behavioral data actually showed. Reliability is built in exactly those moments. The moments when keeping the commitment is no longer easy, when following through requires something from you that you would rather not give. The person who reliably shows up in those moments, not every time because no one is perfect, but as a consistent pattern, is building something real. The person who reliably finds a reason not to is also building something real. The question is which kind of reality they are choosing to inhabit. The fourth commitment is to let your actions speak more honestly than your words, not more loudly. The person who substitutes dramatic gesture for consistent daily behavior is not demonstrating trustworthiness. They are performing it. But more honestly, there is a version of ourselves that we articulate in our self-description. The person we intend to be, the values we hold in principle, the kind of friend or colleague or partner or leader we consider ourselves to be. And there is the person that our accumulated daily behavior actually reveals. The most important work any of us can do is to close the gap between those two people. To be as honest, as generous, as loyal, as accountable in the ordinary moments, when no one is evaluating us, when the cost is real and the reward is not visible, as we are in the moments we describe when asked who we are. This is why the willingness to accept responsibility without deflection is one of the most powerful signals of character you can send, not the performance of accountability. The elaborate acknowledgement of error that is immediately followed by an equally elaborate explanation of why it was not really your fault, but the clean, uncomplicated recognition of where you fell short, followed by a genuine change in behavior. People who can do this are rare. People who encounter someone who can do this tend to trust them at a level that years of good performance could not generate on its own, because the willingness to say, I was wrong and here is what I am going to do differently, is one of the clearest signals available that someone is operating from an honest orientation toward reality rather than from the need to manage their own image. The fifth commitment, to bring the language of trust into how you communicate, may be the most immediately transformative of all, because language is the most visible dimension of who you are. Every conversation is an opportunity to demonstrate or undermine the kind of person you are trying to become. The language of trust has a specific shape. It centers on the other person. It seeks to understand before it seeks to be understood. It builds up rather than diminishes. It is honest rather than strategic. It is consistent whether or not anyone important is listening. It does not debate to win. It does not perform generosity in public while practicing something different in private. It does not use the vocabulary of virtue to accomplish the purposes of self-interest. It is simply honest. Honest about what it knows and does not know. Honest about what it can and cannot do. Honest about what it thinks and feels and wants, expressed with enough care for the other person that honesty serves connection rather than destroying it. This is harder than it sounds. Honest language that serves connection requires holding two things simultaneously: a commitment to truth and a commitment to the well-being of the person you are telling it to. Neither alone is sufficient. Truth without care can wound unnecessarily and close what it could have opened. Care without truth can comfort in the short term while building a relationship on a foundation of pleasant fiction. The combination, the truth, offered with genuine concern for how it lands and genuine respect for the person receiving it, is the language that builds the kind of relationships that last. And then there is stability, the sixth commitment, and the one that underlies all the others. The work of cultivating genuine emotional stability is the deepest work in this entire framework. It cannot be faked. It cannot be performed. It is not the product of discipline applied to the surface of behavior. It is the product of an honest, ongoing relationship with your own inner life, with your fears and needs and insecurities, with the ways that desperation changes you, with the patterns of reactivity that emerge under pressure, with the gap between who you are when things are going well and who you become when they are not. The most honest question you can ask yourself about emotional stability is not, am I a calm person, but how do I behave when I am afraid? Fear is the central force that disrupts stability, and it is also the most universal human experience. Everyone is afraid of something. The question is what you do with the fear. Do you bring it into your relationships in ways that make those relationships have to absorb it, in the form of volatility or manipulation or withdrawal or the 1,000 other ways that unprocessed fear expresses itself in behavior? Or have you developed the internal resources to process fear without exporting it, to feel it, to understand what it is telling you, and then to act from something larger than the fear itself? This work is not done once. It is ongoing, and it is never perfectly achieved because life continues to produce circumstances that test stability in new ways. But the person who is genuinely committed to it, who does the honest, sometimes painful work of understanding their own emotional patterns and developing the capacity to respond rather than react, is the person who becomes genuinely trustworthy across time, not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones. Not just to the people who know them well, but to the strangers who will form impressions of them based on a single encounter. Not just in the relationships where the incentive structure naturally rewards good behavior, but in the ones where no one would notice if they cut corners. There is a circle that forms in the lives of people who commit to all 6 of these things, not perfectly because no one is ever perfect, but genuinely as a sustained orientation. They become more trustworthy, and in becoming more trustworthy, they become better able to recognize trustworthiness in others. They attract people who share their orientation toward the world, and those people vest in them as they vest in others. Their relationships deepen and lengthen naturally because the qualities that make relationships last are present in abundance. They become known, genuinely known, not just well-liked. And that knowability is what allows people to depend on them. Their life becomes populated by people whose behavior they can predict, not because they have mastered a system for reading others, but because the kind of person they have chosen to become draws the kind of people they most want near. This is the fullest expression of everything this framework has been building toward. Not the ability to decode other people, though that is valuable, not the skill of protecting yourself from the inevitable bad actors, though that matters too, but the construction of a life and a character that is itself a form of trust, offered freely, earned genuinely, and held with the kind of quiet, unshakable integrity that does not require anyone's observation to remain intact. The world is full of moments that demand a reading of the people around you. Who to believe, who to hire, who to marry, who to build with, who to share your most important work with, who to let close when you are most vulnerable. The 6 signs give you a framework for approaching those moments with something more reliable than instinct, more nuanced than cynicism, and more honest than the comfortable assumptions that have led so many people into avoidable pain. But the greatest gift this framework can offer is not the ability to read others. It is the self-knowledge that comes from applying the same scrutiny to yourself that you have learned to apply to the world around you. Because the person who can honestly ask, do I vest genuinely in others? Do I make the future of my relationships feel real and long? Do I follow through on what I promise? Do my actions match my words? Does my language build or diminish? Is my inner life stable enough to make my behavior consistent across all conditions? And answer those questions honestly, and then do the work to bring their actual life into alignment with what the answers reveal. That person has arrived somewhere genuinely rare. They have arrived at the place where trust begins. Not in a technique, not in a system, not even in a carefully constructed relationship with another person, but in the character they have chosen to inhabit day after day, in the moments that no one sees and in the moments that everyone does. And from that place, everything else becomes possible.